1984 is widely considered to be the definitive work on totalitarianism. In it, George Orwell attempts to distill totalitarianism down to its most base form and emphasize its unique features in order to better differentiate it and its unique characteristics from other forms of government. The book has had a lot of enduring power, and a lot of terms from it have entered the vernacular and often come up whenever authoritarianism, security versus personal rights, jingoism, and kind of any of those related concepts are brought up. Specifically, things like thought police, doublethink, Big Brother, 2 minutes of hate will often come up in political conversations. So, going into this should really be an easy one, right? I mean, this is the definitive work on fascism. This is the book that explicitly tries to tackle it. But, well, as always, I'm going into this one with an open mind. I didn't prejudge it. We're going to go through the criteria that I've come up with and try to determine once and for all, is English socialism, aka IngSoc, fascist? So let's start out with a bit of background. We don't really know anything in 1984 for certain because the past has been erased. There is a certain post-apocalyptic aspect to it. From what we do know reasonably certain, because Winston has a direct memory of it, is the timelines I think were relatively similar up until the 1950s. The Cold War or some other sort of war escalated into a nuclear exchange, and governments around the world collapsed. A political movement called English socialism rose to power following an anti-capitalist revolution, although once again we don't really know that for sure. Oceania, the place where the story takes place, is a combination of the British Empire, the United States, the southern half of Africa, Australasia, and the rest of the Americas. How it managed to conquer all that territory, whether it actually controls any of it, like I said, we don't really know. I was going to try to come up with some speculation, like maybe large portions of that were depopulated in the nuclear exchange, despite not really being key targets. Or a devastated America and Britain decided to invade South America in order to prevent famine, but we really have no idea. One way or another, the superstate of Oceania was founded and continues to 1984 in the book. An interesting side note is Oceania does not have a capital. All we really know is English socialism eventually evolved into IngSoc, which got rid of pretty much all of its ideological substance. As the name suggests, it was some sort of socialist, Marxist, maybe even communist movement, but once it gained power, it more or less abandoned most of the rhetoric of that and became what we see within the novel. It's kind of changed itself into this generic form of totalitarianism, which is kind of a weird concept, wherein the party's sole aim is the absolute maintenance of power. Okay, so now we're going to get into what people might consider to be a really strange take, but stay with me here for a second. So one of the issues is when I go through these, anything to do with fiction, I try to find a real world equivalent, and I couldn't really find a real world equivalent to IngSoc, to the kind of place you have within 1984, at least within the concept of politics. So the closest thing ideologically I could find, and this is going to strike a lot of people as weird, is it kind of reminds me of Gnosticism in some ways. At least that's the closest thing I can think of. So at the core of Gnosticism, you have the world soul or the invisible spirit or the one or the absolute. And you are part of that, but your existence is separated from it because of an illusion. That is, it depends on the version of it. There's all kinds of different ones. But in many versions, the material world is evil. You have been forcibly separated from the one. And your goal is through self-discipline, secret knowledge, and a variety of different ways to work your way back so you can achieve liberation and rejoin the world soul. So what does this have to do with the party? So it took me a while. I was kind of going through this. So I was reading through the O'Brien speeches, and he gave one that I think really kind of summarizes it and gave it a bit more coherency. Because one of the issues is I don't really get why anyone would follow this, even as brainwashed as they are. So he says that, well, freedom is slavery. Slavery is also freedom. The individual has basically no power, no authority, no ability to change history on their own. But as part of the party, as part of this big, powerful institution, they are able to do it. And the idea is to remove all distinction between the individual and the party and to kind of return to it. That everything that's done is like a ritual or is kind of a spiritual mental conditioning to erase any distinction physically or metaphysically between the individual and the party. And so the perpetual good of the party and the perpetual power of the party is theoretically benefits the individual in the sense that they are part of the whole. It's a really kind of, in some ways, twisted view of looking at kind of organic or integralist thought. There's some other kind of interesting aspects of Gnosticism. A core part of Gnosticism is there is tiers of hidden knowledge. The plebs or the followers might have a very limited understanding as they are viewed as spiritually and mentally incapable of engaging with the deeper truths. And as you proceed further and further up the ladder, you gain more and more secret knowledge. And it seems fairly clear that that is the case. And eventually, in some Gnostic interpretations, there is the priestly caste. And I think you can kind of do a certain degree of comparison between the priestly caste in a Gnostic, or I also say a Hindu type of situation, with the inner party members. Like in Hinduism, you have the once-born castes and the twice-born castes. And the idea is only Brahmins can achieve moksha or liberation and return to the Paramatman or the world soul. And through losing your individuality, you lose your access to, you lose fear, betrayal, death, and the self ceases to exist. Now, is this kind of an overly charitable or relatively, I guess you could argue, benevolent way of viewing the party? Yeah, certainly. I'm probably painting them out in some ways to be more noble than they are, but I always like to kind of take a different take. I like to try to bring something a little bit different to the table, and this was really the only thing similar. Because once again, I wanted to figure out why people would follow this kind of institution, as bad as it is. What's also interesting is, similar to North Korea and Songbun, there is a caste system. Not just a spiritual one, but there appears to be a, I don't know if biological is the right term, hereditary caste system. My understanding is you are born into the party, you can't join it. So if you're a prole, I don't think proles are allowed to join the party, maybe in extremely rare circumstances. But generally speaking, if you're born, from my understanding, to an inner party member, you're a party member. If you're born to an outer party member, you're an outer party member. Or just a member of the party in general. The inner party will occasionally recruit from the outer party if they show particular aptitude for the traits they select for. But in practice, most members of the inner party come from members of the outer party. Now, in the context of North Korea, you have the loyal, wavering, or rather core, wavering, and hostile castes or classes, and it's based on where your family was at the time of the revolution, with descendants of revolutionaries being in the core, and descendants of Christian missionaries or oppositions to the revolution being in the hostile class. So I'm just going to read a passage that I think kind of reinforces this. The individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. You know the party slogan, freedom is slavery. Has it ever occurred to you that it is reversible? Slavery is freedom. Alone free, the human being is always defeated. It must be so, because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape from his identity, if he can merge himself in the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. The second thing for you to realize is that power is power over human beings, over the body, but also over the mind. Power over matter, external reality, as you call it, is not important. This one was actually pretty difficult for me to go through because it's so stripped down and the totalitarianism is so lacking in any of the specifics that would make it kind of identifiable. It's hard in a lot of ways to compare it to fascism, which tends to have very strong national and cultural particularities. Although once again, you go, well, Argent has to score high. This is the definitive book about fascism. Well, we'll take a look and it might score a bit different than you'd be thinking. Okay, so criteria 1 on my Is It Fascist scoring list. Criteria 1, an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary conservative ideas and revolutionary progressive ideas. I'm going to have to say a big no to this one. IngSoc is not a syncretic ideology. As far as I can determine, it incorporates no reactionary or conservative elements. The fact that the entire past is just eliminated. There's no real appeals to tradition. There's not really any kind of focus on traditional hierarchies or anything like that. I guess you could argue if it exists long enough, then maybe the party and the current system will become a new tradition. But I don't really see anything particular to the society, like anything inherently. In this case, they live in Airstrip 1, which is, once again, the fact that they would rename Britain Airstrip 1, I think kind of tells you everything you need about reactionary elements. But there's nothing particularly British or American or Oceanian about it. And the other superstates have the exact same ideology, more or less. Like communism or classical liberalism, I would say it's a fully rationalized and artificially constructed ideology. So but what I mean by a rational ideology is someone thought about it, they went through first principles, they thought about what sounded the best, what they thought would work the best, and they constructed it based on that. It's not something that evolved organically over time. It's supposed to be universal and applied in any time or place. And fascism is always, it's very much based in what the host culture is. At least that's what I find. If you look at the different movements that emerged during the 1930s and 40s, it's very particular to the country. The Iron Guard in Romania was exceedingly religious because Romania is a deeply religious country, and Christian Eastern Orthodoxy is very directly tied in with the national identity. Nazism emphasized scientific racism more so, and Brazilian integralism was specifically non or anti-racist and favored a Catholic national identity. So we're going to have to say no on this one. Next one, identitarianism with a clearly defined in-group and out-group, cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. Now, some people might disagree with me on this one, but I'm going to have to say no. While there is ultranationalism, it's basically just red team versus blue team. Their jerseys are a different color than ours, so we hate them and we want to fight them. The hate between the different superstates is not based on race, culture, religion, ideology, or any characteristic beyond name. Other than just the state that they come from in a very kind of basic sense, and there isn't really much of a difference between them. There is no really difference that you can point to. You could argue that identitarianism exists with regards to the social castes, but once again, dividing humanity up in that fashion is not explicitly fascist. You also will get that under communism with like the landlord and the working class that people are born into and can't really escape. So I don't think that's necessarily fascist. Once again, while there's a hereditary component to it, this is something you'll often see in Marxist systems. It's very common in China and I believe in the Soviet Union to have the next generation of leaders largely come from inter-party members. So I don't think any of this is really identitarianism as we would normally associate it. Criteria 3, a revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. So once again, we have ultranationalism being promoted. It lacks any kind of romantic quality. There's something very sentimental about fascism, at least as how it was practiced historically. For Mussolini, it was invoking the grandeur, the image of Rome, wanting to return Italy to what they saw as their glorious past. For Hitler, you had Wagner, you had all these Nordic symbolism. You had the Volk and stuff like that. In Japan, you have the Divine Emperor, you have the Kokutai. You often will have, to a certain degree, ironically enough, you will have a rewritten past, but it will be an idealized version of the past that did exist. Oceania does not have a past. History is constantly rewritten, so there is no romantic nationalism. So revanchism, in a very vague sense, does exist, but it's completely synthetic. A lot of fascist movements emerged or were partially motivated by, like I said, a desire to get revenge on a historical foe. Nazism obviously was largely based on overturning Versailles. While I wouldn't consider Horthy to be fascist, I would imagine the Arrow Cross and just a lot of the authoritarian right in the country were driven to ally with the Axis in the hope of avenging the Treaty of Trianon, which had dismembered Hungary, giving most of its land and to the surrounding powers. Regardless, though, it's kind of an example of revanchism. It's an example of an actual, real or perceived historical wrong that they're attempting to correct. While citizens are told that all societal problems are caused by enemy superstates, it's a very hollow narrative. There's no historical memory behind it. It's more like we're going to fight the capitalists because the capitalists are ideologically bad. Then the capitalists are our historic foes. Criteria 4, a belief in the supremacy of the party or state. I don't think I really have to go into much detail about this. We'll read a quote from 1984. You must understand that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be the truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. There is no difference between party and state. And then heading on to my part. Yeah, so there's no difference between the party and state. There's not really a civil society. What exists is just kind of performative and directly controlled. In contrast, in actual fascist governments, in particular, the more religious ones, you'll often have a little bit of a counterbalance, if nothing else, because you'll often have corporations and there will be a private sector, and there will also be the religious institutions will have at least a little bit of autonomy and a little bit of ability to counterbalance the government. But in the case of 1984, it's a big no. This is a weird one. Criteria 5, a conception of an idealized new man. Bizarrely enough, this actually does fully apply here, although it's extremely different from the fascist or even communist conception of what the new man should be like. The party's ideal new man is someone with no independent memory, feels no personal loyalty or emotional ties with any other human beings, loves the party, not from coercion, but as genuine emotional orientation, is incapable of doubt, desire, or private thought, and welcomes surveillance and internalized discipline. The party's ideal new man is passive, submissive, and weak, lacking any of the heroic virtue or ability to act as you see it in fascism. Fascism calls on you to be a man of action, to fight the enemies of your country, to protect your family, to be masculine. That doesn't really exist at all. It's the exact opposite. Even within communism, depending on the version of it, sometimes they will have aspects of that too, but they'll often kind of glorify the individual if they do, like, oh, they're a worker, they work for the common good, they provide for their family, sometimes they'll do. But there is this conception that, like, the new socialist man is this compassionate, loving, selfless person. And you'll see aspects of that in more Catholic variants of fascism, where because they're based in part on Catholic social teaching, they will hold things like compassion and charity as being core values. So it is the complete opposite of what is seen in fascism, but it is very much the idea of a new man, something that is completely reconstructed. So we're going to have to give it a point here. Okay, a foreign policy that places national self-interest above ideology or morality. So I'm going to say 100%. Despite the rhetoric of ultranationalism that we got to win this war, we have to defeat the enemy. Our entire purpose is like there's a war economy, there's the 2 minutes of hate. There's really no attempt to win the war. Now, in the book, it's stated that the states are too powerful for anyone to lose, even if the other two ally against it. I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's pretty clear that there's been some sort of agreement to get rid of nuclear weapons, but if one superstate was able to develop them in secret and gain kind of an advantage, they might well be able to win the war definitively. Or if they engage in certain technological advantage, maybe they would be able to gain the upper hand. But there's a general agreement, whether formal or not, that the war has to be kept to certain areas with small scale, highly trained forces, and it's just there to burn off excess capital and production and to maintain the power of the individual regimes. And basically, all the rhetoric is just completely pointless. It doesn't really mean anything. Okay, an indifference to or marginalization of economics. Now, this might be something that people will disagree with. The reason this is here is because you hear, like in Nazi Germany and Japan and stuff, this focus on will, the triumph of the will, if you will, that if the nation is strong enough, if the people are determined enough, they can overcome material shortcomings. So, in the case of Oceania, and people might disagree, I'm going to say the verdict is no. So we're going to get a double negative here. But in other words, the party does care about economics very much so. It is very central to how IngSoc retains power, but it's in a perverse anti-prosperity way, which is something you just really don't see. The economy is not ignored, but deliberately manipulated to maintain scarcity and reinforce the existing power hierarchy. Production is calibrated with a lot of state planning, so it won't grow, there won't be innovation, it won't empower citizens. All the excess production is used in warfare, with probably a little bit of it going to the inner party to prevent any kind of development of prosperity, which might lead the inner party or the outer party or the plebs time to start developing their own independent thoughts and maybe wanting revision to the system. By keeping them always on the edge of starvation, they're completely dependent upon the system. And they're not quite starving, so they're able to keep stumbling along. But if they were to disrupt the system, they would almost immediately die of starvation. So there is this very Marxian, scientific, materialist concept where there's production and consumption and the means of production, and they just talk about it in a very kind of clinical sense. That reminds me a lot of kind of how communist regimes work. Okay, next one. A masculine approach to problem solving, focusing on decisive action. I'm going to have to say no with this. Once again, there is no man of action. Now, you could argue in some societies, it's not necessarily that the individual is the man of action, it's the government. And in this rhetoric, they're like, we're going to get rid of the inefficiencies of democracy. We just need someone who can get things done. We need someone with the executive power to just blow through all the obstacles. There's all this dithering, and we aren't fighting the true enemy. And while you could argue that the police state and the ultranationalism in the war kind of represents this, I'm going to have to say no. Because the ideal citizen, once again, is weak, submissive, and cowardly. There's no initiative, personal courage, or problem solving. The government is incredibly inefficient by design, largely incapable of doing anything by design, and power is massively decentralized, so there is not really any kind of decision-making body. Once again, fascist states glorify masculine vigor and willpower. Mussolini posed on horseback. A lot of them wear military uniforms. military strength and ability are really emphasized. So in IngSoc, there is no space for heroism, only obedience. Okay, next one. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. Now, this is one that I think you can really make the case for yes, no, or partial. I decided to go with partial as a compromise. So while the proles have a couple performative rituals like 2 minutes of hate, from my understanding, genuine political engagement is discouraged. The party wants compliance, apathy, and a lack of interest in the broader social picture when you're dealing with the proles. What's the expression? Only animals and proles are free. There are some agents among them, but generally speaking, the less they have to do with politics, the better. Now, within the party, both the outer or inner, yes, every aspect of their life is subject to the party. They're constantly monitored. Their personal relationships are suspect, if not explicitly party approved. Sex is often viewed as a bad thing because it promotes self-actualization. There is a complete and total concept on this on the way of life. So there is political action, there is mass campaigns, but it's internalized and not mobilized. You don't have like highly organized street demonstrations or kind of some of the other things you see in a fascist state. So I'm going to give this a partial, but you can make the case for a full yes or even a no. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite inner group to safeguard the new order / revolution. Yeah, I think this one is pretty straightforward. Although, once again, this is different to how we often will see it in most societies. They are a pure vanguard. They aren't a vanguard protecting any kind of ideology of the revolution. The expression is one does not establish a dictatorship to safeguard the revolution. One has a revolution to establish the dictatorship. The purpose of power is power. And to a certain extent, even the vanguard, while the inner party lives nicer, they probably live much nicer lives under capitalism. And that's not the primary motivation. So as O'Brien says, the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness, only power, pure power. And even makes a direct comparison to other vanguardist states. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their motives. They pretended, perhaps they even believed, that they seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just round the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. So you establish like the people's dictatorship or the vanguard or something to that effect until you get through a specific stage of socialism, after which point the state will just kind of melt away. So it's weird, yeah, but it definitely counts. Okay, another one that I'm sure people might disagree on. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. People go, well, what about Big Brother? What about he's like the most iconic part of 1984? He's this charismatic, ever-present fatherly figure. Well, the issue is Big Brother isn't a real person. Now, the book suggests that he might have been at some point, but I just tend to think he isn't. If he did exist, he's dead or been purged, and he's a fictional figurehead created by the party to kind of be its representation. To me, he has more resemblance to like Mickey Mouse or Tony the Tiger, being kind of the embodiment and personification of their respective brands, than any kind of actual charismatic personal leader. Fascist movements are generally concerned with the unique personal charms and of the man of destiny, of the man who emerges to lead the movement. And very often their life story and their background is a critical part of their ideology and how people perceive them. If you go through Mein Kampf, a lot of Hitler's past is central to his ideology, like talking about the experience of World War I, the decadence afterwards, his struggles, to try to show that he relates on a very personal level to the frustrations of the average German. And that's a critical part of kind of the narrative or the myth that he was trying to create. Big Brother has no personality, no past, no interior. He's a blank vessel under which obedience and fear are projected. There isn't really a cult of personality in the same way you normally see. In kind of a more modern sense, Trump is often called a fascist based on his personal charisma and how much he just dominates the movement that he leads. Ideologically, it doesn't really MAGA really doesn't have much to do with fascism for any number of different reasons. It's just it would fulfill this aspect of it. So I'm going to have to say partial because you do have Big Brother, but once again, I think you could make the case for yes or no in this situation. And number 12, sublimation of the individual's rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. Yeah, I don't think we even really need to spend much time on this. To quote the book, does Big Brother exist? Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Does he exist in the same way I exist? You do not exist. So yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. And that brings us to our final score. And if you've been counting, you probably can predict what it's going to come out to. And this might be a surprise to some people. It probably isn't by this point because we've gone through it. But the final score for IngSoc from 1984 is 6 out of 12, which means it is not fascist. It is not even para-fascist. It's not even really on the borderline. Which, once again, I mean, this is supposed to be kind of the definitive book on it, but I really don't think it applies. When I was making my scale, there's meant to be a lot of overlap with like conservative authoritarianism or communism, because they share a lot of different characteristics. But the idea is that fascism is kind of a synthesis of a lot of them. And this more resembles kind of communism than any actual form of fascism. So to conclude, while 1984 shares some superficial traits with fascism, Vanguardism, the new man, a foreign policy rooted in power, it ultimately fails to meet the core ideological and structural criteria. There is no identitarianism, no real charismatic leader, no encouragement of mass political action for most of society, no masculine ethos or glorification of heroism. The economy is controlled and not ignored. Generally speaking, fascist economics are very vague and are kind of an afterthought. The party doesn't seek glory, national rebirth, or greatness. It only seeks permanent control, achieved through infinite surveillance, psychological domination, and the destruction of truth. In many ways, 1984 represents a post-ideological dystopia, a system that has abandoned any pretense of moral or national purpose. If fascism is about mythic rebirth, 1984 is about the erasure of humanity itself. The result is not fascism, but something colder, flatter, and more terrifying. So there you have it. That's my the series of hot takes I came up with for one of the most overanalyzed books of all time. The party is Gnostic and it's not fascist. So I think you can't blame me for not being creative when I try to do these videos and trying to put a kind of a new spin on an old concept. So this one was a lot of fun to do. This is one I've been wanting to do for a while, but sometimes for these I really have to kind of sit down and think about it because it is pretty complicated and a lot of these are pretty subjective. And as I said, a lot of these could really go either way, but I think I made the core point I was trying to make. As always, I hope people enjoyed the video. If you have some other ones you want for Is It Fascist, you can post them down below. I do read the suggestions. Obviously, I don't always take them, in part just because it takes a while to make these videos and to do all the research and stuff like that. But I often will eventually get to them. It took me like 10 years to get the Legend of Galactic Heroes, but we got it done. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.